If I see a lynch mob approaching, I'll knock off half a dozen of them before I blew my own brains out. And for that, I don't want a teddy bear. I want a Smith and Wesson. That's Colin Bell, Mosquito Pathfinder pilot, Me-262 survivor. A man who, reportedly still professionally active into his second century, traced a fabricated quote about his own combat missions back to the Ministry of Defence and demanded an explanation. This isn't a story about a charming centenarian who can remember the war. The official record got at least 3 things wrong about Mosquito operations, and one of the last men alive who can prove it's still sharp enough to run a government fabrication to ground, and unimpressed enough to tell you exactly what he found. Bell flew Pathfinder missions. These were the opening moves of Bomber Command's night raids, a small force of fast, precise aircraft dispatched ahead of the main Lancaster stream to locate the designated target in the dark and mark it with pyrotechnic flares, so the hundreds of heavies following behind had something they could actually find and aim at. 4, 5, sometimes 6 hours of flying time over occupied Europe, at altitude, in a 2-man cockpit built largely from Alaskan spruce and English ash, without gun turrets, without the relative safety of a formation, speed and darkness in place of defensive armament. Bell has described, with operational specificity that only survives in a memory that has been regularly exercised across decades, actually sleeping during those missions over Germany. Controlled rest, taken when the aircraft had settled on course and the body required it. During those hours, napping at altitude over enemy territory, his revolver sat within reach. Not as comfort, as a specific operational tool with a clearly reasoned purpose. RAF aircrew knew, from the accumulated testimony of those who had come down and survived, that pilots who landed in civilian-controlled areas before any military authority arrived sometimes never reached a holding facility. Bell had made his calculation in advance. If German civilians found him before the Luftwaffe did, he intended to make that encounter cost something before it concluded on their terms. He chose his instrument accordingly, the Smith and Wesson, because it addressed the most probable terminal scenario with the most practical available response. Nothing sentimental, just a clear accounting of the range of outcomes and the right tool for the worst of them. Published scholarship confirms what that clarity has produced over a working life that extended well past the war. At least 2 major published histories of Mosquito operations identify him by name. One describes him specifically as an acclaimed Mosquito pilot, who was, at the time of that volume's publication, in his 102nd year and still very active. Another comprehensive history thanks him by name for accounts the authors describe as providing invaluable insight into what it was like to fly and fight in the Mosquito. Archives preserve what was written down. What was written down was filtered through institutional processes that determined, before the pen reached the paper, what counted as sayable. Bell's memory holds what those filters removed. His aircraft had nearly been killed by the same institutional instinct that would later manufacture his words. Geoffrey de Havilland designed the Mosquito from Alaskan spruce and English ash with deliberate industrial logic. Aluminium was rationed and competing simultaneously across every British aircraft programme. Woodworking skill, by contrast, already existed in furniture makers, coach builders and joinery apprentices across Britain, Canada and Australia. No retraining required, no single facility a German raid could eliminate, no supply chain running through one choke point. The proposal was coherent, detailed, and supported by a worked-out engineering argument. Air Ministry committees considered it and produced confident institutional resistance. The committee's objections centred on the unconventional material. Scholars have examined this episode under the heading Freeman's Folly, named after Air Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, who championed the wooden aircraft programme into existence over that resistance. The label Folly is itself a document. It records what the institution thought of his judgment at the moment he made it. Those committees weren't operating in bad faith. They were applying the professional standards of a culture that rewarded caution and treated unconventional certainty as a warning sign rather than a signal. That culture produced the wrong answer, with full institutional authority at length in writing about the aircraft that would end the war with the lowest loss rate of any type operating in RAF Bomber Command. On January 30th, 1943, 3 Mosquitoes reached Berlin and knocked out the main broadcasting station, while Luftwaffe Chief Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was mid-speech, putting his broadcast off the air. Göring had personally guaranteed British aircraft would never reach the German capital. 3 aircraft assembled from furniture joinery answered that guarantee on the date he had specifically chosen for a public pronouncement of German invulnerability. The committee system's confident wrongness was demonstrated at the highest possible symbolic level by the most public failure of the most senior possible German official, and the civil service machinery subsequently recorded the achievement in the official history with the full authority of the same institution that had nearly prevented the aircraft from existing. Into that legacy flew Colin Bell and, eventually, into encounters that should by rights have killed him. The Me-262 entered significant operational service in late 1944 and early 1945, faster than any Allied piston-engine aircraft it could engage. His Mosquito came home. The parenthetical in those published histories, and Me-262 survivor, exists because that parenthetical earns its place. A crew that met an Me-262 and came home had navigated a window measured in seconds at the absolute edge of what both the pilot and the aircraft could jointly sustain. That is the man whose words the Ministry of Defence apparently believed it could improve upon. The first thing Bell has described that the institutional record failed to examine with adequate directness begins with the geometry of night bombing, specifically what a Mosquito looked like from behind, in the dark, at altitude, through the plexiglass of a Lancaster rear turret. Seen from astern at night, the Mosquito's twin-engine profile was visually inseparable from the German aircraft the Luftwaffe deployed specifically to exploit that similarity. The Junkers Ju-88 and the Messerschmitt Me-410 both practiced approaching the Lancaster stream from behind, matching the bomber's speed and silhouette long enough to close to firing range before any definitive visual identification could be completed. Deliberate, practiced infiltration approaches designed to place a gunner in precisely the position of maximum uncertainty at the moment of maximum danger. Understanding what that uncertainty felt like from the inside requires the full environmental picture. A Lancaster rear gunner occupied a plexiglass bubble at the tail of the aircraft, having partly removed the sliding doors behind him for better visibility, which meant the temperature around his body at 20,000 feet was somewhere between 20 and 40 degrees below 0 Celsius, depending on the night and the season. His electrically heated flying suit held the margin between continued function and frostbite severe enough to end the mission involuntarily. Engine vibration fed through the aircraft structure in a sustained mechanical frequency that accumulated differently from ordinary fatigue, an unvarying insistence that never relented across 5 or 6 hours of flight. At altitude, in sustained cold, after 6 hours of vigilant watchfulness in complete darkness, the specific cognitive modification from reduced oxygen and exhaustion produced a state of judgment the gunner very likely couldn't fully measure from inside the experience. An unidentified twin-engine aircraft approaching from astern was a decision measured in under 10 seconds. Waiting for positive visual confirmation, holding fire until the shape resolved unambiguously into something friendly, meant giving any enemy aircraft in that position the time it needed to fire first. Ju-88 and Me-410 crews had demonstrated, in actual Lancaster losses, that the wait was a methodology that got rear gunners killed. What Bell has described as an established counter-practice emerged from what the RAF had paid to learn. In those specific conditions, for that specific combination of circumstances, the defensive calculation favoured the gunner who didn't hesitate. Every Mosquito near the returning stream, every Pathfinder, every night intruder, every fast twin-engine aircraft doing exactly what Bomber Command had dispatched it to do. Presented from behind in the dark, the same profile that practice had assigned to the threat category. The system designed to protect Lancaster crews had been built with a gap through which its own aircraft could fall. The gap was shaped exactly like a de Havilland Mosquito. A confession surfaced after the war ended, as Bell has described it, from a Lancaster tail gunner who admitted to expending 600 rounds on a friendly aircraft. 600 rounds from a 4-gun rear turret represents continuous firing across several sustained bursts, a committed and extended attack on a target the gunner had identified as hostile and pursued through the darkness. He'd been following the practice his training and operational culture had established as the correct response to exactly those circumstances. The friendly aircraft apparently escaped through the dark rather than because the gunner stopped. The confession documents what the practice was producing when it operated precisely as designed. A man who had spent 600 rounds on his own side believed at the time he was applying correct procedure and carried the knowledge of what he had done until he found a way to say it. Those conditions, the counter-practice Bell describes, what that practice demonstrably produced, are the framework that makes the death of Wing Commander Guy Gibson worth examining in a new way. Gibson died on the night of the 19th to the 20th of September 1944, near Steenbergen in the Netherlands, while flying a de Havilland Mosquito in a controlling role for that evening's Bomber Command raid on Rate. He was the most decorated airman in Britain at that moment. Victoria Cross, Distinguished Service Order and Bar, Distinguished Flying Cross and Bar, leader of the Dams raid of May 1943, an operation that had attached his name to a national mythology reaching well beyond any single war or service. His Mosquito went down. The official cause was never established. Fuel starvation, anti-aircraft fire, a German fighter, and navigational failure have each been advanced across the subsequent 8 decades. None has been definitively confirmed. Bell's account of the counter-practice raises a question the official investigation apparently never pursued with sufficient directness. Whether a Lancaster rear gunner, following the operational practice Bell describes as standard, engaged a twin-engine aircraft approaching from the direction of the returning bomber stream that night, and whether that aircraft was Gibson's Mosquito. A controller flying near the heavies in a twin-engine aircraft at night on a route placing him in the vicinity of the returning stream, in conditions where the distinction between a Mosquito and a Ju-88 was a matter of seconds and altitude-modified human judgment. The structural conditions Bell describes were real and operational on that specific night. As evidence currently stands, this doesn't resolve to a definitive conclusion. But the question, properly stated, is more honest than any explanation the official record has published across 8 decades of confident uncertainty. Bell's first-hand account of what that practice produced provides a mechanism the institution failed to examine with the directness the evidence deserved. The second institutional failure is more precise as a specimen of how official history manufactures itself, and considerably more personally targeted. During operations, Bell encountered an Me-262 and survived. Exactly what that encounter involved, his altitude, his decisions, the specific sequence of events, Bell knows, because he was there. At some point after the war, a journalist published an account that included quotations attributed to Colin Bell about that encounter. Bell hadn't given those quotations. He traced the provenance. The journalist's explanation, according to Bell's account, was direct. "I got it from an independent source, the Ministry of Defence." An independent source. A government department, thousands of feet below Bell's Mosquito and decades removed from the encounter, had been cited as an independent authority on what a living man had experienced and said about his own survival over Germany. Words he hadn't spoken, attributed to him as authentic veteran testimony, originating from civil servants who hadn't been in the cockpit and weren't in a position to reconstruct what had happened there. Bell's response, reportedly, carried the quiet authority of a man who has accumulated sufficient data to classify a behaviour without diplomatic softening. But then, civil servants tend to be like that. That sentence is a verdict. It also describes a pattern that runs across the entire documented relationship between this aircraft and the institutions that oversaw it. Air Ministry committees in 1940 filled the gap in their evidence about the Mosquito with what sounded authoritative. The MOD later filled the gap in Bell's testimony with what also sounded authoritative. Both failures grew from the same root: institutional confidence operating at a distance from the actual event, with no correction mechanism that could reach the man who was actually there. He is the correction mechanism the institutional system didn't build in. His precision, at an age when most people have long stopped tracking the provenance of their attributed statements, is the inconvenience the system didn't anticipate when it decided to manufacture his words. The third failure sits apart from the other two. Where the friendly fire problem grew from tragic systemic logic built into the geometry of night operations, and the MOD fabrication was deliberate, this one was simply operational incompetence, and Bell still believes, decades later, it warranted a court-martial. A group navigation officer miscalculated the timing for a Mosquito operation and routed Mosquito crews through the returning Lancaster bomber stream. Bomber Command coordinated multiple distinct phases in every major night operation. The main Lancaster force outbound on one timetable, Pathfinder Mosquitoes on timing sequences specifically designed to keep the faster twin-engine aircraft clear of the heavies in both directions. Tolerances were tight. A few minutes' error placed Mosquito crews inside exactly the environment the counter-practice had designated as a shoot-first scenario. Twin-engine aircraft appearing in Lancaster rear turrets from astern, in the dark, without a confirmed identification signal. Those timing sheets may have looked coherent on the page, figures that balanced, calculations that correctly added up, while the underlying assumption about where the bomber stream would actually be at what time contained an error the arithmetic was powerless to catch. He flew through the stream his own side had routed him into, and survived the geometry the navigation officer's timing sheet had placed him inside. Decades haven't altered his assessment of what that error should have cost the officer responsible. 3 failures. A counter-practice that converted Mosquitoes into valid targets for their own rear gunners. A government department that fabricated a veteran's testimony about his own survival over Germany. A navigation officer whose miscalculation delivered his own side's aircraft into a shoot-first kill zone. The civil servants who nearly refused to build the Mosquito. The civil servants who manufactured its pilot's words. the systems that produced all three. Each shares the same structural characteristic: institutional confidence operating at a distance from the actual event, with no mechanism capable of reaching the man who was actually there. He has been that mechanism himself, across decades of engagement with historians who sought him out specifically because his memory carries what the institutional record compressed, simplified, and, in at least one case, apparently invented. There's an urgency to this that sits entirely apart from any institutional argument. The generation that flew those missions, sat in those rear turrets, and made those survival calculations, is leaving at the only pace that generation has ever moved. Centenarian veterans who hold living memory of those operations are being reported as having died with increasing frequency now, each one closing a corridor of knowledge that no archive can fully replace. Bell's memoir, expected in the coming years, will carry his first-hand corrections into the permanent record, in a form the institutional history will have to contend with directly. Until it does, the fabricated quotes, the unexplored mechanisms behind unsolved deaths, and the confident official certainties sit in the archives as the authorized account, attributed, in at least one case, to a man who was in the cockpit and says none of it accurately reflects what happened there. Someone watching an earlier version of this story wrote that these are the last years we have with the opportunity to talk to veterans of the Second World War. 74 people agreed. That observation is simply accurate. Bell is among the last people alive who flew those operations from the inside, who carry in first-person memory what the official record compressed, and who remain willing to make the phone calls required to correct what the institution got wrong. Another commenter mentioned being a plumber from Cumbria who had once met a Mosquito pilot called Dickie Bird. 47 people engaged with that unprompted. If you have a connection like that, a grandfather's story, a name from a family conversation you could never trace further, a photograph of someone standing beside an aircraft you've never been able to identify, the comments are the right place for it. These connections exist in living memory and nowhere else. The ones that get written down somewhere, in any form at all, are the ones that outlast the generation that holds them. In New Zealand, craftspeople are reportedly working from the original wartime de Havilland plans to build new Mosquitoes, a claim that requires independent verification. The wooden wonder being assembled again from the same materials Geoffrey de Havilland specified in the drawings the Air Ministry committees nearly buried. The aircraft isn't finished with the world. Colin Bell is still here, still specific, still unimpressed by institutional authority that has lost track of what actually occurred. His Smith and Wesson sat on his lap over Germany while the Lancaster stream found its targets in the dark below. And somewhere beyond his cockpit, a rear gunner sat in a freezing plexiglass bubble watching for twin-engine shapes approaching from astern. Both of them were following the logic the RAF had given them. The full and accurate record of what that logic produced, written correctly and completely, still depends on the men who were there to ensure it. Subscribe for more stories like this.